and thanks for joining me. My name is Joy, and I'm so excited to welcome you to my show. I'm a mom trying my best to raise two teenagers in this new world, a world very different from the one I grew up in. And to be quite honest, there are days when it terrifies me. From the effects of social media, to vaping, to the extreme competition of sports and academics, I wonder some days, when is it that my kids can just be kids? I wonder how it's affecting their self-confidence and happiness. And quite frankly, I wonder how it is affecting my parenting, because I'm torn between what is best for them and what is a reality. My kids have had cell phones since they were 10. And honestly, my husband and I made this decision because they were doing sports and theater and needed a way to get in touch with us for pickup and drop off. And it gave us all a sense of connection. How ironic, a sense of connection. Ha! Studies show that cell phones have made us feel less connected and isolated and lonelier than ever before. Social media has added a whole other level of feeling less than and left out. We'd have to live under a rock to miss the fact that stress and anxiety is affecting our children. And that is today's subject. Today, I will be speaking with Superintendent of the Bedford School District, Mike Fournier, and Diane Vaccarello, owner and licensed therapist of Bedford Family Therapy, who serves on the New Hampshire Board of Mental Health. Good morning. How are you guys?
Good morning, Joy.
Good. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
So, Mike, I would like to start with you. Give us an overview of what the district is seeing with regards to stress and anxiety in our students and our kids in our community.
So, first of all, thank you for doing this show. I really appreciated your opening line because what you shared resonated with me as a dad, having three kids. They're a little bit older, but still, I still have a junior in high school, and a lot of what you said I really makes me think. But as a district, we do have one of our goals is to help reduce stress and anxiety among our students. And one of the things that we try to distinguish is there's stress and anxiety that kids have that is developmentally appropriate, meaning we all have stress and anxiety that is typical. So the day before school starts, if you have butterflies in your bellies, that's normal. If you have a chemistry test the night before, you're going to be a little nervous that, I hope I do well. If you're trying out for a sports team, you may wonder how you're going to do. That's all typical. But as you mentioned, we're in this world where stress and anxiety is becoming bigger. It's impacting our kids more. And as Diane will likely tell you, it's becoming more clinical. And I think as parents, it's very difficult to understand sometimes when it crosses that threshold. So in our schools, we are seeing more and more anxious kids. And so from the very early stages, that can be them not wanting to separate from mom and dad to come to school. That can be part of the anxiety. Some of it, as they get older, can be comparing themselves to other students and how well they do academically, how well they perform on sports teams. For adolescents in particular, it's how they look, how they dress, their family of origin. And to your point regarding social media, there's this persona that we all have on social media. And our students don't always recognize that that is not reality. And when they compare themselves to that, they feel as though oftentimes they fall short. And one of the things that I think studies have shown is, kids, whether on Instagram or TikTok or the different things that they're on, for every like they get, it's sort of dopamine goes off in their brain, right? And so they receive a lot of their positive reinforcement from that. And when they don't get as many likes as they think they should or that a friend gets, they start questioning their self-worth.
It could be devastating. Are you hearing some of the same things? And what kind of advice are you giving to parents and teens when they sit down in your office?
For sure. I really appreciate the comment about the sort of science behind the dopamine response, things like that, that I think we can all appreciate how that feels for an instant or for a moment. The problem is that it ends up being very superficial and short-lived. And so there's this thread around what actually brings us happiness, what brings us connection in more of a long-term kind of fashion, and how can we encourage that in our kids in a way that is more sustainable, as opposed to constantly searching for that next sort of feeling and misunderstanding that that's not true connection. And after a while, really experiencing feelings of loneliness, which adds to a whole nother layer. I think there's certainly anxiety across the board. I think there's even sort of anxious parents at times and anxious kids and an anxious sort of society or culture in which we really are being bombarded by a lot of even really goal-directed ways of living. And so we're working hard to achieve certain things, and we can kind of see how that feels as a dopamine response and kind of check that box off. But then we're coming back down and saying, what's next? And then what's next? And then what's next? And that happens in a school environment, around the idea of grades and the idea of achievements and accomplishments. It happens in the real world for us as adults in different ways. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think it's really important for us to really dig into the study or the science behind what constitutes happiness and joy, and how can we get more of that.
Right.
And so one of the things that I see a lot on social media, I belong to a bunch of the Bedford mom groups and New Hampshire mom groups and things like that, is what is the appropriate age to give my child access to a cell phone or access to Snapchat or access to Instagram? What kind of advice would you give a parent who's asking those kinds of questions? Well,
I think it's really important not to take a one-size-fits-all approach. I think understanding, getting to know our children in particular, how they manage distress, how they manage their time, how they manage, I think it's helpful when a person can really take a look at the big picture and say, I think that this child could really actually benefit from some of that. Maybe the idea that you mentioned in the beginning that it's a logistic thing, it could be helpful in collaborating or coordinating sort of efforts around, pickups and things like that. But is your child ready to really understand that they need to be able to put it down at a certain point in time, and it takes practice. So part of it is a little bit trial and error and being really tuned in and attentive to how the child's using it, in the sense of, is there a problem? If there's no problem, there's no problem. Is it getting in the way of schoolwork or sleep, for that matter? Are we able to experiment with this a little bit and set some boundaries and limits around it? And is that child able to manage that?
What are some signs
Right.
that we should look for in kids as parents that show that they aren't managing it well?
So may I jump in real quickly?
Yes, of course.
I want to add to what Diane said, which is really good, the idea of not one size fits all. But so a couple of things to consider when parents, when I was a principal, I got this a lot. When should my child have access to Instagram? When should they be able to be on social media? So the first thing is the industry sets standards of age 13, right? So they already tell you shouldn't give it to them when they're younger than 13. So there's that for parents to fall back on. But the second is, I think it's really important to individually to set expectations in your family, right? That this is not a right, it's a privilege. And you as the parent retain ownership of that device, whatever it is, when you give it. And so there's some things that some families have done which I really admire, and I didn't do this myself and probably should have, but so for example, at night before bed, all cell phones get charged in the kitchen, right? So that it's not on your bedstand, not the first thing you look at
There's
before
no
you go to
temptation.
sleep,
Right.
no temptation. And so as long as your child, when you give it to them, understand what the restrictions are. The other piece is many families feel pressure. As a mom and dad, you feel pressure that, well, everybody has one, so I want one too. And so I think from a parent standpoint, you need to step back and say, I'm going to trade in this pressure from my child for another whole set of pressures. Mm-hmm. And you have to weigh that out because you may no longer be hearing that I don't have something that everybody else has, but then you will be hearing about the consequences of now having that device and what the social media does in terms of how I feel about myself.
That's
and
an excellent point.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm
And
sorry
it
to
is by-
interrupt.
no, but it is by a case-by-case basis and really knowing your child.
And how they're
what
responding.
They can handle.
Right.
Exactly.
Maturity plays a role.
So the district has a new initiative of reducing stress and anxiety. What prompted this? Was there something that actually prompted
Yeah,
this
so
new
I think
initiative?
I don't know that it was sort of there was a specific catalyst, but I think over the past several years, teachers have really noticed that kids have seemed more stressed out. Parents have definitely indicated to us that their children are more stressed. And then we do this tripod survey where parents respond on a weekly basis. And one subset of the questions that we recycle over and over through the year is, how stressed out is your child? So some of the trends we see are typical. So for example, at the end of the quarter, when grades are due, we notice a spike in stress and anxiety among kids. That's an expected outcome. But we also try to dig down into what are some things in our schools that we can do to reduce that. And so some of those things are building trusting relationships with adults, helping kids understand how to build relationships with one another. So whether that's advisory at the high school or connections at the 5-6 school or responsive classroom and circle time where a group of third graders sits in a circle and problem solves about a problem that they're having in class, or maybe difficulties they're having on the playground. Because another area that becomes stressful for kids is when there's conflict and they don't know how to resolve it. They're not, if conflict has been resolved for them and they get to a point where they are faced with a conflict and don't have the skill set to resolve it, that can be really challenging and stressful for them. And then they act out in a way that the only way they know how.
I think that's a really good point, Mike, that matches some of the trend that I've seen over the course of time with regard to really the goal. We're raising adults. We don't want to treat them exactly like adults, but we're raising adults, not kids.
Right.
We eventually, the goal is for them to be able to be
Not
successful
living in my basement,
on their
please, Lord.
own, and having, we're born dependent on parents. We need to get good at being dependent in order to survive. And then that switches to learning how to be independent. And then ultimately, we're actually looking to achieve interdependence. And that's a whole nother layer. So dependence, I like to use the metaphor of like a backpack, climbing, something of that nature, where you could, if you're sort of dependent, somebody else is packing that backpack. And there's maybe beef jerky in there and water and whatever else. You may have certain dietary needs, you have whatever the case may be, but you're dependent on that person knowing you well enough for packing what's needed. But every time you need a sip of water, you might need to ask for one. That's fine for a certain period of time, but eventually we want our children to know what they need to pack in their own backpack. So they're not caught off guard with regard to not having the resources, which goes back to what you were saying, really teaching them what their needs are. And they have a pretty good innate sense for some of that as well. We just need to tune into that and help coach them along with some of
As opposed
that.
to do it for them.
Yeah, exactly.
as
Because
they
then
get
how are they
older.
going to know what to pack?
And I find too that parents, as a parent, I get frustrated when my kids at a certain age weren't doing it. And honestly, it was my fault because I was making it too easy for them
Well, it's
and
easier,
not teaching them.
It's easier to do it for them because we are
want
all
'em out
so
quicker.
busy.
Right.
We're busy, we're rushed.
And checking the box.
You just want to get it done.
Yes.
Which is part of that sort of frenetic energy too that I think builds with the anxiety. And it's just like, what is our actual goal here? Is it just to have all of our stuff in a bag and hurry up and get out of the house? Or are we able to slow down from time to time? None of us are
Something
perfect.
that you have said that has always hit home with me, Diane, is this is a marathon.
Not a
it's
sprint.
not a sprint.
Right.
Kids
That's right.
aren't one size fits all
Right.
either. Like
Right.
how they learn and how quickly that they how quickly they learn at what age, what is age appropriate, but also that as parents we have to remember that this is There's a
Right.
long road ahead.
And it's
Can you
not just
elaborate
about,
on that a little bit?
sure. Yeah, it's not just about the award at the end of that either, of a marathon or sprint. It's really about the process along the way of what are we learning and acquiring for tools in that toolbox, so that we're not just reaching in and there's one tool. And maybe there's a really nice gadget that fits a lot of different things, but we want a lot of different tools for different situations. And we find that the broader that base is, the more tools a person has, the more successful, but also satisfied and happy, because they do feel like they can rely on their own skills and their own abilities. And we do know that, emotional intelligence is tied to this idea of practice and acquiring different skills. And we can increase our emotional intelligence 35 to 40%. Just another interesting data point here around the idea of happiness, because this really is linked into it as well, is that we're responsible for about half of our happiness. In other words, 50% or so is tied to genetics and environmental scenarios. And the other 50% is tied to our own ability, which is really good news, right? That's 45 to 50% that we can control around our happiness. And what I find is that kids, teenagers, and adults tend to be happier when they have more control over their own situation and their own abilities. So when we can really broaden that, then we see a trend with that, and we also see less depression. Because obviously if somebody is stressed and anxious and nervous and they're chronically that way, that gets really old. It gets really depressing. It gets really tiring. And so we're noticing that there's a shift. There's definitely anxiety present across the board in large ways, but we're also noticing increase in depression. And that is linked to an increase in suicide rates in New Hampshire in particular. So all of these pieces are connected and they all need our attention. Really does start with having us be well equipped. And as parents, we need to help with that.
We have the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and that indicated that 43% of students feel like they don't matter. That was a
One of the statistics that came out.
Yeah, that was a killer.
That's a tough stat.
It's a very difficult stat, and one of the things this doesn't directly answer that question, but earlier you had said, what can we do as parents? And a couple of things that I think are important are, one is I think we need to help normalize things for our kids, whether it's a classroom teacher, a mom and dad, or a coach. And so the first thing to do is to normalize. So for example, we had a student years and years ago that was afraid of throwing up. That's kind of a typical fear among kids. And so as a parent, you want to protect your child and say, no, you're not going to. It's okay, you're not going to help them feel better. And what that does actually is creates a false sense of security when you really need to say, well, you're probably going to.
Right.
And
it's going to
stink. If you do.
And if you do,
you're going to get over it.
You're going to be okay.
That's right.
Right? And so to normalize things when your child expresses fear and anxiety to you as a parent is to say, you know what, I felt the same way. Or
instead of playing into it.
Right, to be able to say this is a normal way to feel and it's okay to feel this way. I think that empowers them. Now you're the clinician.
I think you're doing a great job of that. That's exactly spot on. Yeah.
But I think it helps them not feel alone, because I think the other piece is students can oftentimes feel like they are the only ones. Now part of that has to do with child development and being egocentric, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but
is it in a frontal lobe way?
A developmental stage.
A developmental stage of they're just thinking of themselves, and so to help them with that, I think, is important.
Because again, we have to get good at being dependent, as I was mentioning, and then we have to get good at being independent. And I just wanted to finish that thread around interdependence is something people don't really talk about as much. And it's really critical in terms of mental health. So that interdependence is both people packing a backpack of things that they need, but maybe also if you're bringing the granola and I'm bringing I don't know. I love
water.
a good Snickers bar, but something like that, where you're doubling your resources if you're interdependent in a connected sort of relationship, as opposed to just being dependent or independent. And I think in society we've put a lot of emphasis on and priding ourselves maybe in being independent, but we're really losing sight of the interdependence. That idea of connection and relationship is really critical for not feeling invisible, as a kid or a student. And yes, they're going through the developmental stage of really trying to figure themselves out. They need to be sort of consumed a little bit with what that is. They're developing an identity. And then their goal is to be differentiating from their parents and launching as a family life cycle stage that comes next. And if they're launching and not prepared, we're not going to be perfectly prepared, but part of the preparation is to learn how it is to be uncomfortable and tolerate distress and things like that come with real life. And so if we don't allow some of that to come about while they're under our homes, they're under our roofs and in our schools, how are they going to really feel very well prepared to make mistakes or to tolerate that kind of level of discomfort, which I think a lot of us can appreciate. There's fear around failure. There's fear around...
Well, and we're seeing a lot of kids going off to college completely not prepared.
Right.
And coming home and the parents are saying, how is this happening?
Right.
And
or
I will tell you, like right now we're going through the college application process. I'm completely stressed. My daughter, I'm certain, is feeling my stress, my husband's stress. She's stressed. How do we, we're putting our dreams on her. She is trying to figure this all out and navigate it. How do we alleviate that when we all know that in today's world, it is stressful. It's so different from when we all applied to college. And so how do we as parents manage our own stress and not put it on our kids, and also at the same time help them navigate their own stress?
I think the idea of, you mentioned the fear of them sort of like not being successful, maybe, and coming
we're
back.
already through the packing stage.
Yep.
We're through that stage.
So again, with the
Now what?
interdependent stage, that's a piece. That there's a sort of a center space that we're looking for with that. So yes, there might be that sort of fear, and people joke about the idea, or in reality, kids are coming back home. But there's also the other end of that spectrum where they are going out on their own and they are floundering, but they're not asking for help. So part of that is learning how to be vulnerable, but not a victim necessarily, right? But it's really, yes, the balance of vulnerable and thriving, but really trying it out on our own a little bit. And then if we're noticing certain signs, then it's reaching out, whether that is for, in terms of those connected relationships and family or friends or mental health services at a college, whatever kinds of supports are needed. Part of that starts with us at home, really breaking down some of that stigma of, having conversations around, I know what that feeling in the stomach is. We know that that's a chemical spill, stress hormone,
as opposed
right?
to the snowplow parent who wants to just make it go away.
Right. So it started out, I feel like, as kind of helicopter parents, right? Back
just sort of hovering.
Yeah. Hovering, yeah. And I'm sure that we can all sort of notice there were certain trends with that. And then it moved into sort of more snowplow parents and lawnmower parents, whatever.
What's the difference?
Metaphor you want to use. Well, it's those are really similar in the sense that they're just driving forward
and plowing the obstacles out of the way
instead of even hovering. And but now it's doing it,
just removal.
It's removal. It's we want kids to be successful, therefore we're going to clear out all these things that could possibly lead to anything else
uncomfortable.
And then kids aren't learning how to
Right.
And how does
conflicts.
that affect teachers in the classroom?
Well, it's interesting. So what I was going to share earlier, this plays right into it. I'm kind of glad you asked. Is so in my house, and I'm not recommending this for every house, but in my house, my wife and I sort of established this thing when our kids went through the middle school phase and even into high school, which was, we call it high stakes, low stakes, right? So if one of our kids forgot their homework, for us as parents, it was low stakes. But for them, as the student going to face the teacher, it was high stakes. So we had to make a decision early on in middle school to say, we can either save them from that, or we can allow them to walk through that process, face the fear of not turning in their homework assignment, face the consequence, and say, well, that was really uncomfortable, and we're sorry that you had to go through that, but hopefully you won't go through it again, right?
It's a good point, because it's who owns what. We have to figure that out.
And it's a good litmus test, I think, because then, so I have a daughter who's driving, and if she wants to drive during a snowstorm, that's high stakes, high stakes. It's high stakes for her, it's high stakes for us, so the answer is no. I don't think that's being a snowplow. And so that's sort of how we try to decipher, and we're not right all the time. In fact, we're wrong a lot. But I think that that's a piece of the puzzle. So for teachers, I think teachers have a very good sense of low stakes and high stakes. And so one of the advantages that teachers have in the classroom is that for some of them, they've had dozens, maybe even hundreds of students. And so they can very easily tell a mom or dad, yep, Johnny is nervous in my class, but is completely normal. And for you as a parent, Johnny may be your first one or your only one that has gone through the 7th grade or the 9th grade. And for you, it's all new and you don't know. But this teacher has longitudinal data, although it's anecdotal, and they just know. And they would be the ones to be able to say to you, yep, they're a standout. You know what I mean? And they can say, I think you need to think about X, Y, or Z. And if you listen carefully to teachers, you can hear what they're saying.
And part of communication, though, is key, from especially with your first child.
Yeah.
It's really interesting what you're both saying around the idea of if you can hear it, right? We have such valuable information, but we as parents, as just human beings, we need to step back and slow down enough to hear a lot of different things, right? And that leads us back to the idea of self-care as parents. You know, when you were saying this is really stressful, this college process experience and many other things, right, all along the way, and that it's a marathon, not a sprint. So we really do need to be paying attention to our own self-care and what it is that brings us joy, what it is that, you know, we're able to tolerate an awful lot as human beings. It's pretty remarkable, actually, but we do need to have intermittent periods of joy or, you know, self-care in order to really be sustainable. And we can tolerate a lot, but we need to teach our kids that. So some of the...
But aren't we taking some of that ability away by the overpraising?
Sure,
Not holding kids accountable, consequences, things like that. Are you seeing in your practice of parenting and also in your practice that is something that our generation is struggling with? We are overpraising. We are having a more difficult time creating consequences and things like that. Why and how do we?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that question because you know, again, with the idea of self-care, we can go too far with self-care. I just want to say, to a certain degree, if we're just so focused on that, at a certain level, we need to again, not get so comfortable in things that we are not able to practice being uncomfortable, problem solving, getting out of situations. So I think we want to role model a nice balance. And so some of the things, I just want to bring some literal kind of like things that people can be doing, take or leave anything that doesn't fit your own family. But one example that I talk with families about is at a mealtime, if we get a mealtime together, right, of slowing down enough. It's not the number of times that we can connect, but it's the quality of the connections.
Right.
So being able to have conversations, for example, the rose and the bud and the thorn. And so there's the idea of the thorn being kind of the negative thing that happened, or when you mentioned, we made a mistake. Even in parenting, we all make mistakes, but we can actually share with our kids some of the mistakes that we make, whether it's at work, whether it's at whatever situation. Allow them to see that we make mistakes, that we can be vulnerable, but most importantly, sort of share with them how we recovered from that or what we did in that situation.
Right.
And, you know,
set the example.
Set the example. The bud being something that we're looking forward to, you know, being able to look forward to things, future kinds of things is a sign of mental wellness. You know, when somebody's really, really depressed, they're not thinking forward. When somebody is really, really anxious, they're always thinking forward. A lot of times they're thinking in the future and they're not able to think about the now. And that rose is really what we're grateful for, thinking about now.
Hopes and dreams, like Chief Blavatsky says all the time.
Yeah, it's almost like, are you almost saying we need to live in the present? We can have sort of a foot moving towards the future and hopes and dreams, but we need to also live in the present.
Enjoy the moment.
And enjoy the moment. When you talked about college applications, so I have 2 sons in college, and I'm watching kids go through the application process. I think we need to say Bedford is a bit of a pressure cooker. We have a lot of type A, high-profile families with high expectations for their kids. And
I don't know anybody like that.
And kids who have high expectations for themselves, right? And that's a great thing to have. High functioning, it's very good. But it's also important, I think, again, my opinion, is that we've got to be careful that we don't make the college process the pinnacle of your educational career whereby everything teeters on that moment. Do I get into my school or do I not? Because there's over 3,000 colleges in the United States.
There's some place
for everybody.
Or gap years or not even.
And so if you apply to 3, 4, 10, 15 places, there's going to be a right match for you. And if you go to a school and you find that it's not the right match, well, guess what?
You can transfer.
You can go somewhere else. And so I just want to share that because sometimes I feel like...
And it was the greatest thing I ever did.
Yeah.
Because we just have to be we need to be careful not to set up these expectations to such an extent. And I'm watching it with my daughter, who's a junior, who's trying to make all the right, perfect decisions.
Because it's all the talk in the cafeteria, and it's all the talk when there's at sports practice, and it's all the talk, and it's all the talk at the dinner table too. We can't help ourselves as parents, right? We have dreams too for our children of what we want for them and all of that. But you know what? There is something to be said, like you said, also of the joy of just learning.
Well,
and the joy of going to school and being with your friends and being in the moment. Absolutely, in the ride.
And you're all kind of in this together. Like we all remember, we all remember hearing that the junior year is the most difficult, right? We all hear it. But you're kind of on this boat with all your friends, and you're going through it, and you're kind of bonding.
Absolutely.
But I think that I think families, again, I go back to this idea that if you have to listen, right? So you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. And as a parent, you should proceed accordingly. The more you listen to your kids, the more you're going to learn. And don't always feel like you have to tell them. Like listen and ask questions, because
love that.
Through questioning, they will know what you think, right? Have you thought about any other schools? Is that school your favorite school?
Why?
Why is it that you are really thinking that you want to go to school here?
And by doing that, we're giving them, or at least creating space or holding space for more autonomy, for them to think for themselves, for us to do more coaching than rescuing, of that process. And that's shifting out of that snowplow or lawnmower kind of positioning. And it's really stepping back and creating more space. And creating more space allows us to drop our shoulders, kind of relax, our breathing, all these things. It also builds
the connection between you and your kid.
And it builds trust.
The relationship.
It sort of gives an inference too that I'm not only interested in what you're thinking about this process, but I might actually be able to learn something too about you.
Right.
And that's that connection piece that I think sometimes gets lost when we're just in drive mode. And we're going so fast that we can't even see what's out the window. It's going by so quick, and then there's this sense of what happened, like a little bit of a shell shock. So it's nice when we can take the time to process something or just listen, like you're saying, and get curious. Getting curious
is where the fun comes, right?
It's also like it's easier for someone to receive curiosity than something they've already heard 52 times. They're just going to shut down.
Because they know
they
our
already know.
expectations.
Exactly, right.
You don't have to say it, they know.
They do know.
And they feel it.
So what's the good news? What's the positive out of all this? So we know our kids have stress and anxiety. We know that social media is adding to it. We know that we have, shelter-in-place drills in the high school and school shootings, and we hear all the negative on the news. What's the good news, Mike? Give me the good news.
So the good news is, first of all, we have great kids. We really do. I mean, we talk about, every generation has something that they struggle with. And so, I don't want anyone to leave this show or any conversation thinking, oh gosh, this generation is the hardest or the worst, right? That's not the case. They have so much to offer, and there's so much hope and joy in what they bring to the table. I think we just need to be mindful of how we can contribute to that in a positive way, and how we can support them and not sort of add to the things that cause stress and anxiety. So one of the things I wanted to say earlier was we need to be mindful of our own sort of selves. Our kids can feed off of us. If we are stressed, if we are anxious, if we are nervous, they know it, they feel it, and that gets projected on them. And so while it's very important, I think, to share with our kids and be open, sometimes there are things that grown-ups need to know and talk about that is not appropriate for a third grader to know.
Sure, the boundaries.
Or a seventh grader, right? And so I think it's just sort of understanding those. And I know it's hard when you're at home and you're doing it for the first time and kids don't come with a playbook. But I really think that listening, asking questions, and if you don't know as a parent if your child's stress and anxiety is typical or atypical, call the school guidance counselor or talk to your teacher. I mean, if you call Diane's practice, you might need to wait a while before you get in, right? So as you first start, just talk to the teacher and say, this is what I'm seeing at home.
They spend more time with our kids than we do during the day.
And they will tell you, does this seem normal or not? Or go talk to a guidance counselor who are there. They can tell you that, because as parents are good. They have intuition about how their kids are doing. But just seek out some information, I think. I don't know what you think about that.
Absolutely. I agree that the idea of connecting with your child first, getting curious and asking them how things have been going and what's been, and we know our kids. We know when, I think to a certain degree, when there's a level of anxiety. To your point in the very beginning, you said there's some good purpose that stress and anxiety serve. It helps us to be focused at times. It helps us to really hone in on like a target. It
builds grit.
It's part of that caveman brain, right? This fight, flight, or freeze. We have to focus on like basically shooting an arrow, and hitting a target or whatever it is that our goals are. But in life, we're not meant to live in this constant state of fight, flight, or freeze. And that's the part where we really have to understand the difference between useful stress, eustress, E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S, is good stress. And then what is not so good stress. And when we are checking in with the resources, we have fantastic teachers, school district paying attention to things like this, community. People really, I've noticed a shift with even the stigma attached to some of this. Stand By Me is something that the school puts on, and I've spoken at that several times. And I've noticed a shift with seeing now the siblings of some of those students that had come before, and they're not only like signing up for those classes, but they're asking incredibly emotionally intelligent questions. Their awareness, I think, is higher. And some of the kids are literally going to their parents saying, I feel like I need some extra help. They're noticing what some of the signs and symptoms are. And so I think a lot of that is really good news for being able to get support. And it can be through a mental health provider, it can be from a friend, it can be from a family member. Again, that's the benefit and really strong need to have connected relationships, whatever those may be. Just a few of them will do the trick. It doesn't have to be a ton, but just some that can be trusted makes all the difference of creating more hopefulness and less of a feeling of stuckness. And that is where we can make whatever changes we set out to make.
I think too, for families, you've been asking, what can a family do, right? I think that balance of work, rest, and play, right? All those things are important. And so if you have a child at home that's spending 3-4 hours just sitting at the dining room table doing homework, they probably need a break. Maybe it's go outside and take a walk, or go for a bike ride, or check in with your kids to see if there's something they want to do that might be of interest to them. So I think it's really important for kids to have something that they that they really like. And oftentimes that's a sport. Sometimes it's a club or something that dance, something that's interesting to them, where there's other adults and students in their lives that can sort of be models and examples.
And it shouldn't be a chore. It shouldn't be a job. It should be a passion.
And sometimes it might even be downtime,
Right.
you know?
Or just nothing, reading a book.
Right, because for some
Writing in a
people,
journal.
that's what charges their battery back up.
That sometimes that quiet time. Somebody posted recently an article about our kids don't know how to be bored.
Yeah.
And sometimes I get a little smile on my face when kids will say, I'm bored. You think,
Good.
isn't that the perfect time to figure out what to do
Yeah.
when you're bored, right? And so it just
How
gives
to be.
I always
how to
think
be.
like John Lennon wasn't writing music while he was playing a video game or on Snapchat.
Right,
You know what I mean?
right.
He needed to have downtime, you know, to wonder and dream and think. And every great painting, every beautiful poem, you know,
Yeah.
we just all need to bring it down a notch.
And figure out what works and what doesn't.
Thank you so much to both of you for joining me today, and thank you all for listening. I want to tell you that the Cambridge Family Institute has done extensive research and has found factors that lead to happiness that are lacking in our children's lives, and quite frankly in our lives too. 3 easy ways to alleviate stress: spontaneity in action, finding joy in the simple things, and periods of joy in the challenges of life. So I encourage my viewers not just to think about this, but to act. Set the example for your children. Find what brings you joy and then go do it. Take that cooking class. Grab your friends and head out with snowshoes on a trail. Sign up for dance lessons once a week with your significant other. Laugh more, love deeper, and spread joy. Thank you for joining me, and have a wonderful day.